As the majestic Nile steamer slices through the golden waters under a blazing Egyptian sunset, secrets brew among its passengers. Lady Grayle, the aristocratic matron, whispers her darkest fears to Parker Pyne. "He's trying to kill me, Mr. Pyne. But I won't go quietly." By dawn, she's dead, her face twisted in agony, a cryptic note clutched in her hand. Was it murder, or something far more sinister? One man must untangle the lies, the greed, and the betrayal before the killer strikes again. The sun hung low over the Nile, painting the river in shades of molten gold. Its calm surface reflected the fiery sky, rippling gently as the majestic steamer Cleopatra cut through the water with an air of timeless elegance. The hum of the engines blended with the distant cries of exotic birds, creating a symphony of serenity that enveloped the travelers aboard. Yet, beneath this tranquil facade, the air seemed to pulse with an unspoken tension, like a warning whispered by the ancient river itself. Parker Pyne stood at the edge of the deck, his sharp, observant eyes scanning the horizon. A man of quiet demeanor but profound intuition, Pyne had come to Egypt seeking solitude, a chance to escape the incessant humdrum of human complexities he so often unraveled. The weight of his past cases clung to him like a shadow, and for once he longed to disappear into the stillness of the Nile. As he watched the sun sink lower, his thoughts were interrupted by the soft murmur of voices nearby. Turning slightly, he noticed her, a woman draped in pearls and paranoia, her thin fingers gripping the arm of a younger man with the desperation of someone clinging to a lifeline. Lady Grayle, the name whispered by the steamer's staff with a mix of awe and disdain, was impossible to ignore. Her presence commanded attention, though not in the way she might have hoped. Her heavily jeweled hands trembled as she gestured wildly, her voice sharp enough to cut through the gentle breeze. "Do you think I don't know what you are planning, George?" she hissed, her voice low but biting. "I see it in your eyes. You are waiting for the perfect moment to finish me off." The man beside her, stoic and visibly worn down, ran a hand through his graying hair. Sir George Grayle's expression betrayed neither guilt nor innocence, only exhaustion. "You are imagining things again, Eleanor," he said flatly. "You need rest." "Rest," she snapped, her eyes darting around the deck as if searching for unseen enemies. "How can I rest when I am surrounded by vipers? Even my nurse can't be trusted. And you, my husband, are the worst of them all." Parker Pyne, who had been content to remain a silent observer, felt an involuntary pang of curiosity stir within him. Years of experience had taught him to recognize genuine fear, and Lady Grayle radiated it. But was it the fear of a victim or the paranoia of a troubled mind? The line between the two often blurred. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Lady Grayle's voice cut through the twilight. "You there," she called, her piercing gaze locking onto Pyne. "You are the detective, aren't you?" Pyne blinked, startled. "Not exactly, Lady Grayle," he replied carefully. "I prefer to think of myself as someone who resolves human problems." "Then you are precisely who I need," she insisted, her voice trembling. "I am in grave danger, Mr. Pyne. My husband wants me dead. I've seen the way he looks at me, the way he speaks in hushed tones to that secretary of his. They're plotting something, I know it." Pyne hesitated. This wasn't the vacation he had envisioned, yet the desperation in her eyes, the raw edge to her voice, tugged at something deep within him. Against his better judgment, he gave a small nod. "I'll see what I can do," he said. Before he could ask more, Lady Grayle leaned in, her voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "You don't understand," she said. "This is bigger than just him. There are others watching, waiting. They're all in on it." "Others?" Pyne pressed, but Lady Grayle recoiled as if she had said too much. Her gaze darted around the deck, her paranoia intensifying. "Not here," she murmured, clutching the pearls at her neck. "They're listening." Before Pyne could respond, she turned and hurried away, her jewels glinting faintly in the dimming light. The air seemed to grow heavier in her absence, as if she had left behind a trace of her unease. Pyne watched her retreating figure, a deep frown settling over his features. The Nile steamer glided forward into the gathering darkness, its passengers unaware of the storm brewing beneath its elegant exterior. And as the first stars began to pierce the night sky, Pyne couldn't shake the feeling that Lady Grayle's fears, however irrational they seemed, might hold a kernel of truth. But what truth? And how far would someone go to silence it? For now, the answers remained as elusive as the shadows dancing across the Nile's surface. The Nile steamer Cleopatra buzzed with subdued energy as passengers settled into their routines. The faint strains of classical music drifted from the lounge, mingling with the scent of freshly polished wood and the river's cool breeze. Beneath the outward charm of the setting, Parker Pyne sensed an undercurrent of tension, a web of strained smiles, clipped tones, and sidelong glances. Each passenger carried an invisible weight, a shadow of secrets that seemed to deepen as night fell. At the center of it all was Lady Grayle, who commanded attention like a storm cloud blotting out the sun. Draped in layers of silk and diamonds, she lounged in a high-backed chair, her every gesture laced with imperious disdain. Her sharp voice rang out as she berated the staff over an imagined slight. "I asked for chamomile tea, not this swill," she snapped, pushing the teacup away as though it contained poison. Her pale face, lined with years of worry and paranoia, twisted into an expression of theatrical outrage. "Do you think I don't notice these little games, trying to undermine me at every turn?" Beside her, Sir George Grayle sat with the stillness of a man weathering a storm. His broad shoulders seemed to sag under the weight of invisible burdens, his weathered face set in grim resignation. He sipped his drink in silence, avoiding his wife's fiery gaze. The furrow in his brow deepened as she continued her tirade, but he remained unmoved, like a rock against the tide. Across the room, Pamela, Lady Grayle's niece, watched the scene with thinly veiled contempt. "Must you make a scene, Aunt Eleanor?" she muttered, her words as sharp as a blade. Pamela's dark eyes sparkled with defiance, her posture rigid as she crossed her arms. "It's exhausting for all of us." Lady Grayle shot her a glare. "Don't you dare take that tone with me, Pamela. If I didn't provide for you, where would you be? Certainly not gallivanting around like some modern woman." Pamela's lips curled into a bitter smile. "You mean living my life without your constant criticism? A tragedy, truly." Parker Pyne, seated unobtrusively nearby, observed the exchange with quiet fascination. The dynamics between the Grayles were a study in dysfunction: Lady Grayle's paranoia, Sir George's quiet despair, Pamela's barely contained resentment. But they weren't the only ones catching his attention. Hovering at the edge of the room was Miss Elsie MacNaughton, Lady Grayle's nurse. The young woman was thin, her sharp features framed by auburn hair pulled tightly into a bun. Her hands were clasped in front of her, fingers twitching nervously as though she were bracing herself for another impossible demand. Her soft eyes darted toward Lady Grayle often, filled with a mix of pity and something darker: exhaustion, perhaps, or guilt. And then there was Basil West, Sir George's secretary. Tall and impeccably dressed, Basil exuded a polished charm that felt almost too perfect. He lingered by the bar, swirling a glass of amber liquid in his hand. His eyes flicked toward Lady Grayle with an intensity that set Pyne on edge. Was it concern, calculation, or something far more sinister? As Pyne studied the room, a low murmur reached his ears. He turned slightly to see Basil approach Lady Grayle. Their voices were hushed, but the tension between them was palpable. "You shouldn't have said anything," Basil whispered, leaning closer to her chair. "You'll ruin everything." Lady Grayle's eyes darted around the room before she hissed back. "Don't lecture me, Basil. You think I don't know what's at stake? If you'd done your part." Her words were cut off as she noticed Pyne watching them. Her face paled, and she straightened abruptly, forcing a strained smile. "Well, Mr. Pyne," she said loudly, drawing attention to him. "Enjoying the show, are we?" Pyne met her gaze with calm composure. "Merely admiring the atmosphere," he replied smoothly, though his mind raced. What had he just witnessed? A power play? A veiled threat? Or something far more dangerous? Lady Grayle rose from her chair, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her shawl. "I am retiring for the evening," she announced, her voice clipped. "Come, Elsie." The nurse jumped to her feet, casting a nervous glance at Basil before following her employer. Basil lingered for a moment, his expression unreadable, before slipping out the opposite door. Pyne leaned back in his chair, his instincts on high alert. Whatever tension simmered beneath the surface of this group, it was more than petty squabbles or family drama. The cryptic exchange between Basil and Lady Grayle replayed in his mind, each word laced with unspoken meaning. As the lounge emptied, the soft strains of music faded into an eerie stillness. Pyne's gaze lingered on the empty chair where Lady Grayle had been sitting, the faintest trace of her perfume still hanging in the air. He couldn't shake the feeling that this night was far from over and that whatever secrets these passengers were hiding, they were bound to come to light in the most devastating way. In the shadows of the lounge, a single glass sat untouched on the bar. A faint smear of red lipstick on the rim caught the light before disappearing into the encroaching darkness. It was well past midnight, and the Cleopatra was cloaked in silence, save for the faint hum of the engine and the gentle lapping of the Nile against its hull. Parker Pyne had just begun to drift into the rare comfort of sleep when an urgent knock at his cabin door shattered the quiet. "Mr. Pyne," a voice hissed, low and trembling. Pyne opened the door to find Miss Elsie MacNaughton, Lady Grayle's nurse, her face pale and drawn. "She wants to see you, Lady Grayle. She's upset," Elsie stammered, her hands twisting the edge of her apron. "She says it's urgent." Pyne frowned but nodded, slipping on his robe. He followed the nurse down the narrow corridor to Lady Grayle's cabin, where the faint glow of a lamp spilled through the gap in the door. Inside, Lady Grayle sat propped up in bed, her face ashen but her eyes burning with an almost feverish intensity. The room was heavy with the cloying scent of lavender, and the curtains were drawn tightly shut, as though to keep out prying eyes. "Mr. Pyne," she began as he entered, her voice a brittle whisper. "I was right to call you. Something is terribly wrong." Pyne pulled up a chair, his sharp eyes studying her face. "You are feeling unwell?" "It's not illness, it's him, George, my husband." She spat the word like venom. "He's trying to kill me, Mr. Pyne." She leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the blanket. "I know it. The tea he brings me, the pills he insists I take. He's poisoning me, I am certain of it." Pyne's expression remained calm, but his mind raced. "That's a serious accusation, Lady Grayle. Why would Sir George want to harm you?" She laughed bitterly, the sound brittle as glass. "Why, money, of course. I control the purse strings, and he's drowning in debt. He's desperate, Mr. Pyne. Desperate men do dangerous things." "Then let me help," Pyne said gently. "If you are certain of this, I need evidences, something concrete to act upon." Lady Grayle's eyes darted around the room, as though searching for unseen threats. "Here is more to this than you know," she whispered, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "It's not just George. There are others, people you wouldn't suspect. They're all part of it, circling like vultures. I've seen the signs, the looks they exchange when they think I am not watching." Pyne leaned forward. "What signs, Lady Grayle? What do you mean?" But the moment the question left his lips, she froze. Her gaze shifted to the corner of the room, where a faint shadow flickered against the lamplight. She shook her head fiercely. No, I've said too much. You'll only endanger yourself." "Lady Grayle," Pyne began, but she cut him off with a raised hand. "Enough," she snapped, her voice sharp and commanding. "Leave me, Mr. Pyne, and don't breathe a word of this to anyone." Pyne hesitated, but the steel in her gaze left no room for argument. Rising to his feet, he inclined his head. "Very well. But if you need me—" "I won't," she interrupted, her tone final. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye. By the corner of her desk, a single sheet of paper burned in the ceramic ashtray. The edges curled and blackened, the flames hungrily devouring whatever had been written on it. "What are you burning?" Pyne asked, his voice calm but edged with curiosity. "Nothing of consequence," she said coldly, her hands trembling as she pushed the smoldering ashtray aside. Pyne lingered for a moment, his instincts prickling. "Good night, Lady Grayle," he said at last, stepping out into the corridor. But as the door clicked shut behind him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly amiss. The next morning, chaos erupted on the Cleopatra. A steward's panicked cries pierced the air as passengers rushed toward Lady Grayle's cabin. Pyne arrived to find the door wide open, the nurse weeping inconsolably by the bed. Lady Grayle lay motionless, her lifeless body sprawled across the covers. Her face was frozen in an expression of sheer agony, her lips parted as though in a final, desperate gasp. In her rigid hand, she clutched a crumpled scrap of paper, the ink smeared but faintly legible. "They'll come for me next." Pyne's heart sank as he took in the scene, his mind racing. Who had silenced Lady Grayle and why? The questions swirled like a storm as he turned to the others gathered in the room. Sir George stood in stunned silence, his face pale and unreadable. Basil West lingered near the doorway, his expression inscrutable, while Pamela's eyes burned with fury, her fists clenched at her sides. Pyne's gaze fell last on Miss Macnaughton, who knelt by the bedside, her tears streaming freely. "I told her," she sobbed. "I told her to tell someone to trust someone. But she wouldn't listen." The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the faint rustle of the Nile breeze outside the window. Pyne's mind churned, piecing together fragments of the night before. Whatever conspiracy Lady Grayle had hinted at, it was clear she had known too much. As the steamer pressed on through the Nile's serene waters, Pyne's unease deepened. The secrets Lady Grayle had guarded so fiercely had died with her, at least most of them. Pyne's eyes drifted to the scrap of paper in her hand, the cryptic warning echoing in his thoughts. "They'll come for me next." The question lingered like a shadow. Who was they, and how far would they go to protect their secrets? The morning sun bathed the Nile in a golden glow, but on the Cleopatra, the atmosphere was anything but serene. The body of Lady Grayle had been moved to a secure room, but the shock of her sudden death rippled through the ship like a thunderclap. Passengers whispered in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward one another, while the crew frantically tried to maintain order. Parker Pyne stood at the center of the chaos, his calm demeanor masking the turmoil of his thoughts. The cryptic scrap of paper clutched in Lady Grayle's hand haunted him. "The cachet of dreams. Burn this." The words felt like a puzzle, and Pyne hated puzzles left unsolved. "Mr. Pyne, what do we do?" Captain Hamid's voice was tight with anxiety. "If this is murder—" He trailed off, glancing nervously at the gathering crowd. "It is murder," Pyne said quietly, his voice steady but firm. "And if we're not careful, the killer might strike again." The passengers erupted into murmurs of fear. Sir George Grayle, standing near the edge of the room, slammed his cane against the floor. "This is preposterous. My wife was unwell. She's been unwell for years. Her death is a tragedy, not a crime." But his protest was cut short as a steward burst into the lounge, pale and breathless. In his trembling hands, he held a small, weathered packet. "Sir, we found this," he stammered, holding the packet out to the captain. Pyne stepped forward, taking the object and examining it carefully. The label was faded, but the contents were unmistakable. "Strychnine." Gasps filled the room as the steward added, "It was in Sir George's cabin, hidden in his shaving kit. All eyes turned to Sir George, whose face darkened with outrage. "This is absurd," he bellowed. "I've never seen that before in my life." Pamela, Lady Grayle's sharp-tongued niece, crossed her arms and sneered. "Of course you'd say that, Uncle George. But we all know you were desperate. You've been arguing with Aunt Celia for weeks about money. You hated her, didn't you?" "How dare you?" Sir George shot back, his voice shaking. "I've tolerated her delusions and accusations for years. I stayed with her out of duty, nothing more." "Duty," Pamela scoffed. "That's rich, coming from a man who was practically salivating over her will." "Enough." Pyne's voice cut through the room like a whip. The bickering stopped as all eyes turned to him. "This isn't a trial, and accusations won't get us anywhere. We need facts, not assumptions." Pamela rolled her eyes but stayed silent. Sir George, his face still flushed with anger, muttered under his breath but refrained from further outbursts. Pyne turned to Miss Elsie MacNaughton, who stood near the back of the room, clutching a handkerchief. Her eyes were red, and her hands trembled slightly. "Miss MacNaughton," Pyne said gently, "you were closest to Lady Grayle. Did she ever express concerns about her safety?" Elsie hesitated, her gaze darting between Pyne and Sir George. She was paranoid, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. For weeks, she accused people of plotting against her. Sir George, Pamela, even the staff. She thought everyone wanted her dead. Sir George let out a bitter laugh. "There you have it. She was delusional." "But was she wrong?" Pyne asked, his eyes narrowing. The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Before anyone could respond, Pyne produced the scrap of paper Lady Grayle had clutched in her final moments. He read it aloud. "The cachet of dreams. Burn this." Pamela frowned. "What does that even mean?" Pyne turned the paper over in his hands. "It suggests she received a poisoned capsule disguised as medicinia cachet, and she knew enough to try to destroy it before it was used against her." The room fell silent, the weight of Pyne's words sinking in. Then, suddenly, Pamela spoke up. "Are you saying she poisoned herself to frame someone else? That would be just like her, manipulative, until the very end." Miss MacNaughton gasped. "How dare you?" She was terrified. She said she didn't know who to trust. "And maybe she was right," Pyne interjected. His gaze swept over the room, lingering on each passenger. "Someone here wanted Lady Grayle dead. The strychnine wasn't planted in Sir George's cabin by accident. It was meant to be found. But why?" Before anyone could answer, there was a sudden commotion near the door. Basil West, Sir George's enigmatic secretary, stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Pyne," he said calmly, "if you are so intent on solving this, I suggest you start looking at every, including yourself. After all, you were the last person to speak with her last night, weren't you?" The room erupted into chaos, voices overlapping as accusations flew. But Pyne remained silent, his mind working furiously. Basil's words weren't just a diversion, they were a challenge. As the passengers' arguments reached a fever pitch, Pyne's gaze fell once again on the scrap of paper. The cachet of dreams. The phrase gnawed at him, teasing at the edges of his understanding. What had Lady Grayle meant? And more importantly, who had silenced her before she could say more? The dining hall of the Cleopatra had been turned into an interrogation chamber. The rich, polished wood paneling and the glittering chandeliers seemed out of place in the tense atmosphere. Parker Pyne, standing at the head of the room, cast a watchful gaze over the assembled passengers. No one dared meet his eyes for long, each retreating into their own thoughts or their own secrets. "Let's begin," Pyne said, his calm tone underscored by the weight of authority. He turned to Sir George Grayle, whose fingers drummed nervously against the edge of the table. "Sir George, let's address the obvious. Your marriage wasn't exactly blissful, was it?" George snorted, his face flushed with indignation. You didn't know Celia, he spat. She was a tyrant, Mr. Pyne. Nothing was ever good enough for her. And yet I stayed through her tantrums, her accusations. She drained me, emotionally and financially. I am ruined because of her. Pamela, seated opposite him, let out a bitter laugh. Oh, Uncle George, don't act so noble. You were only waiting for her to die so you could crawl out from under her thumb. Sir George slammed his hand on the table. How dare you? Enough, Pyne said, his sharp voice cutting through their bickering. Your financial ruin is noted, Sir George. But did it drive you to murder? George's expression darkened, but he didn't answer. The silence spoke volumes. Pyne shifted his focus to Pamela, who sat with her arms crossed, her sharp features illuminated by the sunlight streaming through the window. Miss Pamela, you didn't seem too distraught about your aunt's passing. In fact, you seemed rather liberated. Pamela smirked, but there was a flicker of something behind her eyes. Nervousness, perhaps. Why would I be distraught, Mr. Pyne? She was a miserable old woman who loved to control everyone around her. She even tried to dictate what I could wear and whom I could speak to. I hated her, yes, but that doesn't mean I killed her. No, Pyne asked, tilting his head. And what about the inheritance? Your aunt's death puts a considerable sum of money in your pocket, does it not? Pamela stiffened, her smirk fading. If you are suggesting I poisoned her for money, you are wasting your time. Unlike my dear uncle over there, I don't need her wealth to survive. Pyne made a mental note of her defensive tone but moved on. His gaze settled on Miss Elsie MacNaughton, who had been unusually quiet. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, and her eyes were downcast. Miss MacNaughton, Pyne said gently, you were Lady Grayle's nurse for years. You must have seen more than most. Tell me, what was your relationship with her like? Elsie hesitated, her voice barely a whisper when she finally spoke. She wasn't easy to care for. She was demanding, cruel at times, always suspicious, always accusing. I did my best, but... Her voice cracked, and she looked away. But, Pyne pressed, leaning forward, you resented her, didn't you? You gave everything to care for her, and she never showed a shred of gratitude. Tears welled up in Elsie's eyes. I never wanted to hurt her, she said shakily. But yes, I was tired, exhausted. I thought about leaving so many times, but she wouldn't let me. She threatened to ruin my reputation if I left her employment. I felt trapped. Pyne nodded slowly. Trapped people can act out of desperation, Miss MacNaughton. But he turned his attention to Basil West, who lounged casually in his chair, an infuriatingly calm expression on his face. And you? Your relationship with Lady Grayle was unconventional. Basil raised an eyebrow. Unconventional? That's a polite... You flirted with her, Pyne said bluntly. You charmed her, manipulated her. For what? Money? She was lonely, Basil replied with a shrug. I gave her attention. If that's a crime, then lock me up. Did you ever think about what might happen if Sir George found out? Pyne asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous tone. Or Pamela, for that matter. You made enemies of the entire Grayle family, Mr. West. Basil's calm facade cracked slightly, but he quickly recovered. You can insinuate all you like, Mr. Pyne, but I didn't kill her. Before Pyne could respond, a loud knock on the door interrupted the interrogation. Captain Hamid entered, his face pale and strained. In his hand, he held a small glass vial. We found this in Mr. West's cabin, the captain announced, his voice heavy with accusation. Gasps filled the room as Hamid placed the vial on the table. The label was faded, but the word strychnine was still legible. Basil shot to his feet. This is a setup, he exclaimed, his voice rising in panic. I don't know how that got there. How convenient, Pamela muttered, her tone dripping with sarcasm. The charming secretary has a vial of poison hidden away. Imagine that. Mr. West, Pyne said, his voice cold and measured. Do you expect us to believe you had no idea this was in your cabin? Yes, Basil shouted, his composure slipping. Someone planted it there to frame me. Who? Pyne asked, his eyes narrowing. If you didn't do it, who did? Basil's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The room fell into a tense silence, the air thick with suspicion. Pyne leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The discovery of the vial changed everything, but it also raised more questions. Was Basil truly being framed, or was he a master manipulator playing the victim? As Pyne's thoughts swirled, the ship's whistle echoed through the air, a haunting sound that seemed to underscore the growing danger. Somewhere on this steamer, a murderer was watching, waiting. And Pyne knew the next move could be fatal. The atmosphere aboard the Cleopatra had become suffocating, thick with tension as the passengers and crew awaited their fates. The whodunit mystery had unfolded slowly, with every step revealing new, more twisted layers. But now, the truth was near. Parker Pyne had his suspicions, but he needed the final piece of the puzzle to expose the murderer. Basil West, who had once been so composed, now fidgeted nervously in the lounge. His eyes darted toward the exits, looking for a way out. But there was no escape now. Pyne had him cornered. You seem a bit on edge, Mr. West, Pyne remarked calmly, leaning back in his chair, studying the secretary with an almost disinterested air. I can understand why. The evidence is piling up against you. Basil's jaw tightened. I've already told you, I am being framed, he said, his voice sharp, though his gaze betrayed an underlying panic. I don't know how that vial ended up in my cabin. Pyne smiled, a thin, calculating smile. But what if I told you that Lady Grayle kept your love letters, Mr. West? What if I told you that I have proof you were feeding her your words of passion, your assurances that you were on her side when in fact you were plotting her death all along? Basil's face paled, his breath quickened, and his eyes flickered toward the door. He was cornered. His attempt to remain composed crumbled before Pyne's relentless gaze. That's a lie, Basil said, but there was no conviction in his voice. I didn't write her letters. What are you? Pyne leaned forward, his voice low but firm. The letters, Basil. They were a way to manipulate her. You fed her paranoia, didn't you? You made her believe that everyone wanted her dead. But the real plan was far more sinister. Basil's eyes widened. He was caught. His shoulders slumped in defeat as the weight of his actions crashed down upon him. He let out a shaky breath and then, as if a dam had broken, the truth spilled out. Yes, I did, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I manipulated her. I convinced her that Sir George was poisoning her. I fed her fears until she was paralyzed by them. But it wasn't just her fears I played with. He paused, looking at the ground, as though he couldn't bear to meet Pyne's eyes. Lady Grayle wasn't just paranoid, he continued, his voice growing steadier. She was weak. I slowly poisoned her, bit by bit, with small doses of strychnine. But I made sure she never suspected me, only George. It was the perfect setup. I knew she would accuse him before she died. Pyne's expression remained stoic, but his mind raced. And Pamela? What role did she play in all this? Basil flinched, his eyes flickering nervously. Pamela, she was the one who helped me. At first, at least. She wanted her aunt dead. She hated being controlled, hated the way Lady Grayle treated her. I promised her I would help her get the inheritance if she helped me. But as the plan went on, she started to realize how dangerous it had become. Basil's words were cut off by a sharp, bitter laugh from the doorway. Pamela entered the room, her face a mask of indifference, but her eyes were dark with something else, fear. So this is the grand reveal, Mr. Pyne. You've got it all figured out, haven't you? Pyne turned to her, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. "Pamela, you were in on it from the start, weren't you?" She took a step forward, her posture rigid, but she didn't deny it. "I was," she admitted coldly. "But I didn't kill her. I didn't want her dead, not really. I just wanted to escape her clutches. I wanted freedom. The inheritance wasn't even my main goal anymore. It was about living my life. Basil told me he had a plan, and I thought it was the only way out." Pyne studied her for a long moment, his mind working through the pieces of the puzzle. And then it spiraled out of control. He said softly, "When your aunt died, you panicked. You realized what you had been a part of, and you wanted no part of it anymore. But you couldn't just walk away, could you?" Pamela's eyes flickered with guilt, but she didn't speak. Instead, her gaze darted toward the door, as though searching for an escape route. Pyne caught the movement, and his voice turned cold. "Pamela, here is nowhere left to run. We all know the truth now." Pamela's lips curled into a bitter smile. "You think you've won, Pyne. You think you've exposed everything. You haven't. You don't understand. None of you do." She turned to Basil, who had been watching her intently. There was a brief moment of silent communication between them, a shared glance that said everything without words. "I didn't want it to go this far," Basil murmured, almost to himself. Pamela's eyes hardened, and before anyone could stop her, she bolted for the door. In a flash, she was gone, disappearing into the narrow corridors of the ship. "Get her," Pyne commanded, rising from his chair, his voice sharp and decisive. The crew moved swiftly, but the ship's narrow passages were a labyrinth. Pyne knew time was running out. Pamela was desperate, and a desperate woman was dangerous. The chase was on. As Pyne followed the crew down the dimly lit corridors, he could hear the frantic pounding of feet ahead. He turned a corner and froze. There, standing at the edge of the ship, was Pamela, her back to the railing, the sea stretching out before her. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. "You think you've solved it all, don't you, Pyne?" Pamela said, her voice trembling with something between defiance and fear. "But you haven't even begun to understand." Without warning, she turned, throwing herself toward the open air, disappearing into the night, swallowed by the dark abyss. Pyne reached the edge of the ship just in time to hear the sound of her body hitting the water. The Cleopatra had finally reached its destination. The Nile's dark waters lapped against the hull as the steamer docked at the harbor. The passengers, tense, nervous, and exhausted, gathered in the lounge, unsure of what would happen next. Pyne's eyes scanned the room, his gaze sharp, methodical, and unwavering. He could feel the weight of their collective guilt hanging in the air like a heavy fog. "Who do you think is the murderer, Sir George, Pamela, or Basil?" "Tonight," Pyne began, his voice calm but carrying the authority of a man who had seen the truth unfold, "we come to the end of this twisted journey." A palpable silence filled the lounge. Every eye was fixed on him. Basil shifted uneasily in his chair, his usually composed demeanor now breaking down. His hands, once steady, now trembled. Pamela stood next to him, her eyes cold but filled with something else, fear, regret, or perhaps both. The others, the weary Sir George, the irritated Miss Macnaughton, and the now quiet Lady Grayle's niece, Henna, watched, waiting for the unraveling to reach its inevitable conclusion. Pyne stepped forward, locking eyes with Basil. "I know it was you, Mr. West," he said softly, but the words struck like a slap. "You orchestrated it all. The poisoning, the manipulation. You fed Lady Grayle's paranoia, drove her mad with fear. But you didn't just want her dead, did you? No, your eyes were set on the inheritance all along." Basil's face paled. His lips trembled as he tried to speak, but no words came out. Finally, with a shaky breath, he whispered, "I didn't mean for it to go this far." Pamela, standing beside him, shot him a quick, accusing glance before her gaze fell to the floor. There was nothing left to hide now. The game was up. Pyne continued, his voice growing colder, more insistent. You knew Lady Grayle would eventually accuse her husband, Sir George. You knew it was the perfect plan, slowly poison her with strychnine, make her believe her own husband was trying to kill her. You had her convinced. But what about Pamela, Mr. West? What about her role in this? Basil stiffened. His eyes darted nervously to Pamela, who stood motionless. She said nothing, her face unreadable, but there was a flicker of something, guilt or fear. Pyne couldn't quite tell. Pamela was your accomplice. She helped you poison her aunt, her own flesh and blood, Pyne declared, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Pamela's gaze shifted upward. Her lips parted as if to protest. But no sound came out. It was true, every word. And now there was no escape. The room went deathly quiet. Everyone knew it was coming to a head. You see, I've watched all of you closely, Pyne said, taking a step back. The pieces of this puzzle fell into place the moment I found those letters. The moment I saw your fear, Mr. West. You couldn't control the situation anymore, could you? You played the game for so long, but now it's over. Suddenly, Basil sprang to his feet, his face contorting with panic. He grabbed a small metal box from his coat pocket and hurled it across the room. No, he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. You don't understand. Before he could reach the box, Pyne was already moving, his steps swift and decisive. He reached the box in a single bound, and with one firm motion, he pried it open. Inside was a final vial of strychnine, the evidence Basil had tried to destroy. But Pyne had anticipated his move. Not so fast, Mr. West, Pyne said coldly, his eyes never leaving Basil's face. He dropped the vial into his pocket with a calmness that contrasted sharply with the growing tension in the room. Basil's face twisted in rage, but he knew it was too late. The truth had come out, and there was no escape now. A soft murmur of disbelief rippled through the crowd as they processed the weight of Pyne's revelation. Sir George's weary voice cut through the silence. So it was you all along, he muttered, looking at Basil with a mix of disgust and resignation. You poisoned my wife and tried to frame me. Basil opened his mouth, but no words came. He was cornered. His gaze shifted from Sir George to Pamela, who was now stepping away from him, her expression conflicted but resolute. Pyne turned to the rest of the passengers. I suggest we let the authorities handle the rest. His voice was steady, his tone unyielding. As for you, Mr. West and Miss Grayle, your game is over. The law will have its say. Suddenly the ship's horn blared, signaling the arrival of the police, who had been waiting at the dock. Officers stormed into the lounge, their presence like a wave crashing against the tense atmosphere. The authorities immediately took charge, arresting Basil and Pamela, who resisted briefly but were quickly subdued. But just as the police were about to escort Basil away, he turned back to Pyne, a final defiant spark in his eyes. You think you've solved it all, Pyne. You think you've uncovered every secret. Pyne raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. I don't think, he replied softly. I know. As the authorities took them away, the Cleopatra slowly began to drift away from the dock, leaving behind the tangled web of secrets, betrayal, and murder. But in the back of Pyne's mind, a nagging thought lingered. Had he uncovered everything? As the ship sailed into the distance, the final twist hung heavy in the air. Was Basil truly the mastermind, or had someone else been pulling the strings all along? The Cleopatra finally docked at the bustling port, its grand hull creaking softly as the passengers began to disembark. The morning sun stretched lazily across the sky, casting a pale glow over the city as if to cleanse the darkness that had lingered on board. Pyne stood at the top of the gangplank, watching the authorities escort Basil and Pamela to a waiting car. The sharp clang of the ship's bell echoed in the air as the passengers slowly made their way to the docks, their faces tired, their eyes haunted. His eyes followed them, but his mind was elsewhere. His thoughts had settled into a quiet, brooding space, The case was over, but something still gnawed at him. He knew he had solved it, and yet the unease lingered deep inside his chest. Greed, Pyne murmured under his breath, watching Sir George and the others leave the ship. He had seen it in their eye-show. It twisted them into something darker than they could ever imagine. How the thirst for power, the hunger for money, had driven them to madness. Basil's manipulation, Pamela's betrayal, Lady Grayle's delusions, it was all a tangled mess of lies. But there was one thing Pyne knew for certain. The human capacity for betrayal was endless. He turned away from the crowd, his gaze distant, almost contemplative. There was a faint pull at the back of his mind, a whisper of something he couldn't quite place. He had hoped to escape the world of deceit and intrigue on this vacation. But, as always, trouble had found him. "A vacation," Pyne said softly, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who had seen too much. He had taken time off to seek peace, to let the weight of his past cases wash away. But it seemed the mysteries, the lies, and the danger had a way of following him no matter how far he traveled. He paused, one foot on the dock, and took in the scene before him. The port was bustling with activity, tourists, merchants, and the sound of life filling the air. It was a far cry from the tension of the Cleopatra, but the lingering shadows of the past still hung in the air like a thick fog. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Pyne." It was Heine, Lady Grayle's niece, who had been oddly silent throughout the entire ordeal. She had been the only one to escape the tangled web of deceit. Her expression was unreadable as she approached him, clutching a small, neatly folded letter. "Yes." Pyne's voice was measured, tired, but still alert. He looked down at her, his eyes narrowing slightly, sensing something off. "I just wanted to thank you," she said softly, handing him the letter. "You saved us all from more destruction than we can imagine." Pyne took the letter, his fingers brushing hers for a moment. He opened it slowly, his eyes scanning the neat handwriting inside. But before he could fully read it, a noise interrupted, an odd, distant sound, like a bell ringing somewhere on the dock. It was a sound he couldn't quite place. Familiar, almost like the sound of a distant call, a pull towards something darker. Pyne folded the letter and pocketed it without a second glance. "I think it's time for me to get away from all of this," he said, more to himself than to Heine. "No more puzzles, no more mysteries, just peace." Heine gave him a small, almost cryptic smile. "Sometimes, Mr. Pyne, the peace we seek is never quite what we expect." Her words hung in the air like a riddle, and Pyne felt a flicker of unease in his chest. He turned to walk away, but as he did, his eyes caught a figure standing near the quay. A tall man, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, with dark hair and a cold, calculating gaze. The man locked eyes with Pyne for a brief moment before quickly turning away. It was the way the stranger moved that caught Pyne's attention, graceful, deliberate, as if he were part of the shadows themselves. There was something about him that sent a shiver down Pyne's spine, and before he could question it further, the man had vanished into the crowd. Pyne stopped. The air around him suddenly felt heavy. His heart rate quickened, and the quiet whisper of Heine's words echoed in his mind. "The peace we seek is never quite what we expect." He turned back to Heine, who was now walking away, disappearing into the crowd. Was there a hidden meaning in her words, or was it just a harmless goodbye? The question swirled in his mind as he glanced back at the distant figure in the crowd. The feeling of being watched, of being pulled toward something dark, lingered like a storm cloud over his head. And then, the most chilling realization struck him. The mystery wasn't over. As the day stretched into the early hours of evening, the distant hum of the harbor seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as if calling to him. There was a new mystery waiting for him, one that had followed him all the way from Egypt to this very dock. A sudden gust of wind tugged at Pyne's coat as he turned to leave, but the strange feeling of being watched never left him. In fact, it only grew stronger. He couldn't escape it, And, more troubling still, he didn't know if he even wanted to. Drop your theory in the comments.